Robert Jarvik wrote, "Leaders are visionaries with a poorly developed sense of fear and no concept of the odds against them." Unquote.
Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is Season 5, The Chaotic Events Leading Up to July 17th, 1980. My name is Reverend David Stevenson. This episode will prepare you for the hour-by-hour docudrama which begins in the next episode. But I need to do a quick review of Bolivia's chaotic politics in the 1970s and tell you where every one of our leading characters were on the morning of July 17, 1980. I'm not in any way an expert on the political history of Bolivia, nor am I a historian who has done the exhaustive research necessary to write such a history. As I've said all along, I simply want to tell the amazing life stories of some of the Bolivian Methodists I have met. But to understand these stories, you need to have a brief overview of the political chaos in Bolivia at this time and how it led to the persecution of the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia. Consequently, I'm only going to give you a brief overview of the political chaos in Bolivia at this time and how it led to the persecution of the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia. Bolivia has an unbelievably chaotic political history. From 1828 to 1982, a period of 154 years, Bolivia had 75 different presidents, acting presidents, or ruling military dictators. Sometimes they would have 3 different leaders in a single year. Usually the changes were military dictators overthrowing each other, but occasionally a military coup occurred in order to be a transition back to democracy. At other times, it was massive demonstrations and strikes that would bring down a dictator and return Bolivia to democracy, only to have yet another coup bring a new dictator.
The military dictators of Bolivia in the 1960s and 1970s were mostly far-right-wing rulers. They were aligned with the Criollo elite of Bolivia and the Roman Catholic Church, and oftentimes had the support of U.S. government. Again, this was during the Cold War, and any enemy of communism was a friend of America, no matter how corrupt or abusive of its own people that government was. Underlining and adding to all this political turmoil in the 1960s and 70s, there was a great fear within the Hispanic ruling class of Bolivia. While the Hispanic elite only made up roughly 5% of the population of Bolivia, they held 95% of the nation's wealth and 100% of its power. The 1952 revolution that had supposedly brought equality for the indigenous peoples of Bolivia had made them voting citizens. However, the ruling class used many different systems to repress indigenous voters. Withholding education was perhaps the key to the continued rule of the elite. Most dictators came down hard on the indigenous people because the dictators were not a part of the vast majority of the citizens who were indigenous, and therefore the indigenous are the ones that needed to be controlled. It was in this cauldron of racism, dictatorships, and oppression that the IEMB developed a theology that says Christianity not only brings spiritual salvation, but is also concerned about human rights, freedom, and the relief of the suffering of God's people. In 1969-1970, there was a short dictatorship by General Alfredo Ovanda, who had promised to be a short interim leader that would restore democracy. It was during that time that the Methodist bishop, along with several IEMB pastors, wrote and delivered the Manifesto to the Nation, which spoke of the Methodist beliefs in freedom, democracy, ending discrimination, and the rule of the people. It had both praises and criticisms of Ovando, but he simply accepted it and then promptly ignored it. Ovando was removed by a military coup d'etat led by 3 generals on October 6, 1970, before any elections could have been held. There were several coups and counter-coups over the next year. Then in August 1971, Generalissimo Hugo Banzer came to power. Now, Banzer was a ruthless ruler who obtained great wealth supporting the growing illegal coca production in Bolivia. Indigenous leaders began to vanish, including the leaders of the opposing political parties. Leaders of trade unions and other groups all vanished. Banzer was equally harsh to Hispanics who threatened his authority. Banzer supported those who continued the hacienda system, especially in the Santa Cruz area. He was intolerant of any popular or union movement. Concentration camps, torture, and people simply vanishing was commonplace. There was a systematic assassination of leftist leaders and the ignoring of human and civil rights. But because Banzer had removed a pro-Soviet leader, the U.S. government ignored the human rights violations and the brutality of Banzerism and supported the dictator. Right in the middle of Banzer's dictatorship in 1975, the Aymara Revolution within the Methodist Church occurred. This revolution kicked out the Argentine, Criollo, or Mestizo bishop of the IEMB and began from 1976 to 1978 to have a period of transition where the leadership of the Methodist Church was being transferred from the Criollo elite to the indigenous people. Zacarias Mamani, an Aymaran, was elected bishop, and Herman, a Mestizo, who had strongly supported the Aymara Revolution, was elected to be the head of services. The urban Criollo were leaving the IEMB, and the Hispanic pastors were moving to the United States, and the U.S. missionaries were going home. General Banzer and his cronies had obviously read the Methodist Manifesto to the nation. The Methodist leaders lived in fear of arrest or simply vanishing, but interestingly enough, the leaders were left untouched. I was told by Bishop Eugenio Poma that he suspected that Banzer and his people knew the IEMB's connection to the United States Methodist Church and was afraid of the U.S. State Department reprisals if they arrested Bolivian Methodists, that it could lead to the withdrawal of U.S. support for their government if they touched the church leaders. But the IEMB was quickly transforming from an urban, middle-class Criollo church into a rural, Campo, indigenous church. And the Methodists were marching arm in arm with those who were demanding a return to democracy. And many of them ended up in jail and were tortured. Wherever there were demonstrations and strikes for democracy, the IEMB usually wasn't involved in the planning of these dangerous movements. However, the demonstrations often included indigenous people making long marches to La Paz to demand democracy. When these huge groups would pass through an indigenous village, it was often the Methodists who fed them, who gave them shelter for the night. And then many Methodists would join the ranks, and the logistical support of the IEMB in La Paz was critical for the demonstrators. This didn't go unnoticed in New York. The General Board of Missions of the United Methodist Church frowned deeply on the IEMB's involvement in politics. The General Board of Gold Ministry and the bureaucrats in New York could have seen the IEMB's conflict with the Bolivian government as God using the IEMB much as he had used Moses to liberate the Jews from Egypt. Instead, I've heard from several IEMB leaders during those days who said that GBGM frowned on the IEMB and its participation in the liberation of the indigenous. There were many people working at GBGM who had been U.S. missionaries during the days of the Aymara Revolution within the IEMB, and the stigma placed on the IEMB by GBGM in those days was still attached to the IEMB in their eyes. In fact, there are those in GBGM who still to this day believe that the IEMB is being controlled by a bunch of radical leftist extremists who want to destroy the church. So GBGM cut off the financial support for the IEMB and its pastors. In addition to that, the Texas Conference, which had been the IEMB's best supporter, also stopped support because of the IEMB's fight for democracy, equality, and personhood of the indigenous people. Bishop Zacarias Mamani, Dr. Crespo, and other members of the executive committee of the IEMB were struggling about how to pay the pastors' salaries and all the other financial needs of the IEMB, which resulted from the cutoff of funds from New York and from Texas. But then Herman said, quote, "I've been to the U.S. The U.S. and United Methodist Church is bigger than New York and bigger than Texas." Because of Herman's excellent English, the executive committee decided to send Herman and Bishop Zacarias to California and the Illinois to try to gain some significant financial support. During his travels, Herman went to Illinois to speak. Margaret Fritz, the daughter of a U.S. missionary to Bolivia, gave Herman a gift, a fancy Texas Instruments calculator. The calculator she selected had an amusing little feature. You could program the sounds of a few notes which would play each time you turned on the calculator. And Herman chose the opening notes of the great hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." So every day for the next couple of years, Herman would turn on his calculator and hear in that quiet computer music style the opening notes of "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." A mighty fortress is our God. Remember this calculator. It will play a very important role in the life of Herman Crespo. And it was during this time that Herman met and married
Elizabeth Narvaez.
There was yet another bloody coup that removed Banzer. But it was led by one of Banzer's closest collaborators, who was just as brutal. And this was followed by several more right-wing military coups over the next year. By this time, the transformation of the IEMB into a primarily indigenous church was now completed. Zacharias Mamani had been elected to a 4-year term as bishop in 1978. He quickly became a recognized spokesperson for human rights, and especially for the indigenous of Bolivia. Although the IEMB never took a public stance on the political turmoil in Bolivia,
It was well known that the IEMB supported the various democracy movements and demonstrations, and Dr. Crespo and the next IEMB Bishop Rolando Viena and other members were actively involved in the Human Rights Commission and in the planning and developing of the national strikes against military regime. In early 1979,
a small group called for mass demonstrations to remove the military dictator Alberto Natache. This time, the Methodists were in the middle of it. The group was made up of leaders of the opposition political parties, the leader of the miners' union, the peasant unions, members of the Human Rights Commission, a Catholic priest, and 2 Methodists, Herman Crespo and Mario Ortega. What followed was 2.5 weeks of demonstrations. In the Campo, indigenous communities would blockade the main road, cutting La Paz off from food needed to feed over 1 million inhabitants. Herman and many Methodists marched arm in arm with the other indigenous people, facing the water cannons, the imprisonment, and yet unyieldingly demanding a return to democracy. Finally, under this intense pressure, the dictator stepped down and the parliament elected a new president. On November 16, 1979, the parliament elected a woman, Lydia Guyer, to become president. President Guyer, naturally, was a Methodist-educated graduate of the American Institute. Yet again, the idea of educating the elite had paid off with a Hispanic leader who was sympathetic to the Protestant church and who worked for democracy and equality. Ms. Guyer was sworn in as president. The Bolivian Human Rights Commission called for a big meeting. The group included all of the political parties, the miners' union, the peasant union, the representatives of the Catholic and Methodist Church. Again, Herman and Mario Ortega attended. Bishop Zacharias Mamani was also a member. Others were invited to attend, but they were afraid. This new group called themselves the Committee for Permanent Democracy. They were under the umbrella of the Bolivian Human Rights Commission. The group felt that God's Spirit was leading Bolivia to a new time. The indigenous people were becoming educated and therefore empowered. The masses of the people demanded that there be democracy, but considering Bolivia's political history, they had little faith that democracy would last exceedingly long. But they also decided that no dictatorship would go unchallenged again. And they knew that they represented thousands of people who were willing to face arrest, torture, and even death to keep all Bolivians free. Here is how Herman described it.
They organized a meeting, all the churches, with all the trade unions and the all political parties, and say, enough is enough. We're going to organize us, and if some of us knows that the militaries again are doing this, we're going to be in a national civil strike.
So it was the trade unions.
Catholic Church
Catholic
and the
Church.
Methodist Church, of course. Everybody was afraid because
So the Catholic, the Methodist, the trade unions, and opposition political parties.
in that meeting says, okay, we need to be organized. Who will be the guy who will organize?
Call together the meeting.
Well, from the political part, we can't because blah, 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 blah. Okay, from the trade unions, oh no, we can't. Also, who will be? No, the Catholic Church is
What they really were saying was, we don't want to be the head guy. When the military police come, we don't want to be the head guy that they're looking for. That's what they really meant. That left it to the IEMB and Herman Crespo.
And then in a few days, we're going to have a meeting again, and you're going to explain us how are you planning to have.
So Herman was chosen to be not so much the leader, but to be the coordinator of this vague group dedicated to freedom and democracy. This was a job no one wanted because they all knew that the person would be targeted by any military coup. The basic plan was that if anyone heard that a coup was coming or had started, they would call Herman. That Herman was to contact the other members of the group with a date, time, and location for them to meet to prepare for the national civil strike to return to Bolivia to democracy. In December of 1979, Bishop Zacharias Mamani and Aymaran still had 3 years left in his episcopacy. And as the Constitution states, the General Assembly elected its new executive committee, except for the bishop. All the persons elected were indigenous, except for one, Dr. Herman Crespo, who was elected to be the head of services. He was responsible for all the schools, hospitals, and clinics, and all the mission work in agriculture and health. At the beginning of 1980, the IMB was terribly busy organizing workshops and conferences all over the Altiplano. There were often large district educational events that focused on Christian education for the new indigenous Methodists, but true to their theology, they also included health and nutrition classes and classes on how to run the church. But in addition to the workshops for the Methodists, Herman and the other IMB leaders were organizing and doing workshops for communities all over the Altiplano. These workshops were called, What Does It Mean to Be in a Democracy? The church asked Herman Eugenio to be among the facilitators of these meetings. These workshops challenged the Aymara people to believe that participating in the leadership of the country and voting was important. And when they voted, they shouldn't take bribes, but listen to the candidates and choose a leader who would be a servant of the people. They didn't recommend voting for a specific candidate, but simply to educate themselves and choose who they felt would be the best president, and then to vote. So early in July 1980, Herman was organizing the Bolivian Human Rights Organization and preparing his response to any future coup. And Herman was working with Eugenio Poma in La Paz, working for the IMB and running workshops on democracy.
So on Wednesday night, July 16, 1980, Herman settled down and took a well-deserved rest, sleeping deeply in his home. Meanwhile, the Corsons had obviously stayed in touch with Ben Ho in Sapetio and provided him support when they could. In 1980, Ben Ho, the Corsons, and CFAT participated in a global research project of Rodale Press and organic farms to find out which variety of amaranth produced better in different climates of the world. Amaranth is a grain that is high in protein that the Maya Indians used to use until the conquistadors and Catholic priests destroyed it because the Mayans called it the food of the gods and used it in several of their religious sacrifices. It has more protein in it than other grains, so that those who ate it were much healthier than the average person, and it's known today as a food that helps end malnutrition. Sarah, took the seed of 5 different varieties of amaranth provided by Rodale Press and formed a team of 17 people in the summer of 1980 to go back to Supetio, specifically help Ben Ho and their team from Supetio to do this research project. But unfortunately, Ken had already committed to go to Haiti that summer. There was a mission down there that was going to get thrown out of the country if they didn't start some technology projects to help the people. The church was just preaching, so they called Ken to come and help them do something for the poor. The church down there knew theology, but they didn't know anything about technology. So the Corsons in the summer of 1980 split up. Chris, their eldest child, now 20, stayed in Milwaukee, Alabama to run CFAP. Ken and their youngest daughter, Karen, went with him to Haiti. And this coincided at the same time that Sarah and the middle 2 kids, Tom and Kathy, along with 15 others, were on a work team in Supetio. The team was going to work with the Supetio locals to develop these fields. The team was made up mostly of college kids with a few adults. There were 2 adult nurses, 2 men in their 50s who were paramedics, and 1 older woman who had gray hair. 15 and the 2 children. And the plan was for the family to reunite at Grandma's house in Miami before traveling back to Alabama at the end of the summer. When Sarah and the team got to Supetio, they discovered that a family who worked for a European development agency had moved into town. The father's name was Adrian. What the agency didn't know was that he was an undercover communist who wanted to develop a communist party in Supetio. But he also did a lot of development work and helped in the educating of local teachers. Adrian tried to convince Ben Ho to return to the Communist Party, but there was no way he was going to leave his beliefs in God and Jesus Christ. At the meetings, Adrian would talk about how terrible the Americans were and that they were imperialist and so on. Sarah decided she was going to talk to this guy because he was in development. She was in development, and they were in the same town, and they needed to be able to talk to each other. But the team members strongly opposed this plan. "Don't talk to him. He's a communist. You're going to get us killed." But she went anyway. The conversation was polite. They eventually agreed that they had the same goals, but just had different strategies about how to help the poor. But Sarah made it clear that she believed in nonviolence. Adrian said Jesus had died 2,000 years ago and his methods had failed many, many times. But they did depart on a friendly basis. Little did Sarah know that that conversation would be the critical step that would save the lives of the 6 adult men on the work team. That's right. That conversation saved their lives. So on Wednesday night, July 16th, 1980, Ken and Karen are in Haiti. Sarah, Tom, and Kathy, along with the U.S. team, are resting and sleeping in their old brick home in Supetio, preparing to work on the new gardens for the amaranth. And Ben Ho was the mayor and local Methodist pastor of Supetio, and he was preparing his sermon for their regular Thursday night worship service. And Sarah and her team and Ben Ho settled down for a good night's sleep. And last of all, Eugenio Poma, who was the headmaster of the public school in Ancarimas, happened to be in La Paz on July 16th. He had spent the day in meetings and gathered some materials to take back to the school in Ancarimas. And on Wednesday night, July 16th, Eugenio was settling down for the night at the IEMB hostel, which is attached to the American Institute in La Paz. And soon he drifted off to sleep. And then the calendar turned to July 17th,
1980. You'll want to listen to the next episode, July 17th, 1980. You will not want to miss it. The main source for this program came from many conversations with a great variety of Methodists in Bolivia. Other sources include the Historia de la Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia, 1906-2006, Una Iglesia Evangelica Inculturada, editor Delphine Quispe, pages 283 to 286, and Wikipedia articles on the presidents of Bolivia. I know I'll see you in the next episode.